No timetable for Ukraine's NATO membership, and China warns the alliance against provoking a confrontation. Hello, I'm Anton Fedyashin, and this is The Heat. With a number of hot-button issues on the agenda, the 31 members of NATO gathered in Vilnius, Lithuania, to chart a path forward. And while Sweden was invited to join the alliance, Ukraine's invitation will have to wait until the end of its conflict with Russia. In the interim, the G7 industrialized nations unveiled a framework for Ukraine's long-term security, something Moscow called, quote, potentially very dangerous. CGTN's John Beaver has more in this report.
Well, before this summit even started, NATO was saying what great achievements had been made. There was an 11th hour deal on Monday night with news that Sweden would soon be joining NATO after Turkey removed their objection for Sweden joining the bloc. So that was the mood going into the start of this summit. President Volodymyr Zelensky, though, quickly soured the mood by saying that he thought it was absurd if there wasn't a timeline for NATO membership. And that is something that really has hung over this summit, and something that NATO has been keen to play down as they play up the support that they say is in place amongst NATO allies and is still there. We've been hearing more from the G7 nations, who've put a very firm frame in place, if you will, very much to help Ukraine with things such as training and finances and equipment and support, and to very much come up with a firm plan, because they're all involved appreciate that this conflict is still continuing to roll on, and Ukraine needs some guarantees when it comes to security. The UK, for example, a member of the G7, said that this new framework builds a Ukraine that can defend its territorial sovereignty both today and in the future. It also includes things such as intelligence sharing as well. We also have the first meeting of the NATO-Ukraine Council as well, which NATO have said means that Ukraine can come to them as equals. They can call for this council when they want discussions with wider NATO allies. So that's something that NATO will be focusing on as well. Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, certainly hasn't left here empty-handed either. There have been all sorts of promises from all sorts of countries about new training and new equipment, new weapons. The UK, for example, providing 70 combat and logistical vehicles. Germany saying they will provide 2 Patriot missile launchers and missiles, along with things like Leopard tanks and 20,000 artillery rounds. Ukraine might not have got the pathway to NATO membership they want, but they've certainly got a lot of support from NATO allies for their continuing fight against Russia. John Beaver, CGTN in Vilnius.
There is much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Andy Mock is a senior research fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. Anton Fedyashin is a Russian and European history professor at American University. Also with us is Anthony Moretti. He's an associate professor at Robert Morris University. And Sergiy Kudelia is also an associate professor. He teaches political science at Baylor University. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. Sergiy Kudelia, as we heard, the NATO summit did not give Ukraine a timetable for membership in the organization. That's something that was not taken very well by the Ukrainian leader, Volodymyr Zelensky. He was unhappy. What Ukraine did get was just a vague undertaking that it will have to fulfill certain criteria, and when the conflict with Russia is over, then NATO would consider its membership. And as our reporter pointed out, President Zelensky called the absence of a timetable absurd. Is this a setback for Ukraine? And if it is, how big a setback is it?
Well, it is a setback, but it is a setback that many analysts and observers expected. And frankly, many believe right now that NATO is making the same mistake that it did in Bucharest summit in 2008. Remember, then we heard for the first time that NATO is willing to see Ukraine as a member, but many criticized it that without giving specific guarantees as to the timeline, it only incentivized Russia to intervene and prevent this membership or accession to NATO from happening. Now, NATO is repeating the same mistake. It is saying you will be brought into alliance only after the war ends. Well, what kind of incentive does it give to the Russian leadership? It gives an incentive to continue the war indefinitely. And even if the war stops for a short period of time, the moment that Ukraine gets closer to the membership in NATO, there is an incentive for any Russian leader, even if it's not Putin, to resume the war or to resume conflict just to prevent possible ascension. So I think it is a setback both in tactical terms, because it fell short of the expectations that the Ukrainian leaders set prior to the summit, and it's a setback in strategic terms, because it means that the conflict may be going on for a very long period of time.
Anton Fedyashin, what is your view on this? I mean, given the absence of a timetable for Ukrainian membership, do you believe that NATO is serious about letting Ukraine become a member of the organization, or is it just stringing Ukraine along?
Unfortunately for the Ukrainians, Anand, I think it's the latter. I agree with what Sergiy just said, except that I would put it in even starker terms. I think that when this the acute violent phase of this conflict is over and we can sort of return to a rational and balanced evaluation of what's been happening in and around Ukraine since 2008 and certainly since 2014, political scientists and diplomatic historians will be poring over the decisions that have been made since the Bucharest summit, and they will have to square this strange circle where NATO has maneuvered Ukraine into accepting all of the risks of NATO expansion without receiving any of the benefits, most importantly, the benefit of Article 5 of a collective defense guarantee. And so Ukraine has been left in the absolutely worst imaginable position of having crossed what the red line that the Russians have repeatedly warned NATO about, and then receiving no NATO support in terms of troops and involvement. All it's getting is weapons. And as we now know from Joe Biden and Secretary of State Blinken and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, the United States is running out. It has run out of 155 millimeter regular conventional shells to supply to Ukraine, which is why it's now moving towards cluster munitions. The West is running out of ammunition, which is absolutely essential for the Ukrainians to hold their lines. So this is the worst of all possible outcomes that's being repackaged or has been repackaged in Vilnius to look reasonably good and optimistic, although unfortunately, again, from the grim realist perspective that I'm coming from, I don't see an end to this conflict outside of a diplomatic settlement.
Anthony Moretti, this was a big international summit. I mean, the leaders of 31 member states there, plus assorted European luminaries, as well as the leaders of several Asia-Pacific nations. The leaders of Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand were there. But when we look at this overall, this big summit, 2 days of talks, what did it achieve?
I think it achieved or it left us with more questions than it gave us answers. For example, the big issue is when this war ends. Well, who defines when this war ends and under what conditions? For example, one could make an argument that the Korean conflict is still going on. There's been no formal end to that war. And so I agree with what our colleagues have already said, which is to some extent, I think both Russia gets played with this, see, we're going to get Ukraine, we're going to bring Ukraine in. I know that makes you upset, but we're going to do it anyway. But on the other hand, the message also, I think, to Ukraine is, well, hang in there. We'll get to you. And the other thing that I think it got left unanswered here was, for the better part of 25, 30 years, it was let's move east, let's move east, let's move east. And all of a sudden, Ukraine is saying, okay, it's our turn. And suddenly there's this apparent caution that is being demonstrated by NATO and probably most specifically the United States. So I agree. I don't think that there was much in the way of accomplishment. Sure, Sweden was given the green light. I think, though, to some extent, that was more of um, a sort of acquiescence to what the concerns of President Erdogan were. But for the most part, I don't see a lot of real success coming out of this. I see more concerns, more questions, and the unanswered issue perhaps is Ukraine simply being played? And I could see several reasons to say the answer is yes.
Right, and just one point on Sweden being given the green light to join NATO. Yes, Turkey did lift the threatened veto on Sweden coming into NATO. President Erdogan said he's not opposed to that any longer, but he subsequently issued a statement in which he said Sweden has to take further steps if the Turkish parliament is to approve the membership of Sweden in NATO. So it's not a done deal yet. Andy Mock, great to have you with us. What are we to make of the fact that there were 4 Asia-Pacific leaders at the summit? As I mentioned, the leaders of Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. I mean, what's the message that NATO is sending to that region? I mean, it's obvious, of course, that these 4 countries are nowhere near the North Atlantic.
No, that's a great question, Anand. So China was mentioned many, many times, many more than in the past. So I think it's clear that NATO is in search of a new mission. I think despite the disaster, as we heard from the previous guest, for Ukraine, that it is in the worst of all possible worlds. And some of the harsher critics of NATO even gone as far as calling it a death cult, and is looking to export that to Asia. But I think on a more hopeful note, we've seen that, of course, the United States plays a very influential role in NATO. Some might even call it the puppet master. But when you pull on the strings too hard, sometimes the puppets don't react well, and we saw France in particular come out with very grave concerns about any expansion, opening an office in Japan. So I think we have to see the silver lining in this cloud. We see what's happening, this disaster in Ukraine. Certainly, I don't think any country in Asia wants to see that replicated in this part of the world.
Sergiy Kudelia, as I said, the Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, he was not very happy with the fact that Ukraine did not get a timetable. And there were, of course, there were differences between Ukraine and NATO on this, but some of that anger actually blew up into the open. It's the first time we've seen that. In fact, responding to Zelensky's anger, the British Defense Secretary said, and I'm quoting here, he said, "People want to see gratitude." And there was also this, according to the Financial Times, a tense exchange between the US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and what was described as a Ukrainian activist in Vilnius. I mean, what does this tell us about Western tolerance for this conflict to continue, and the risk that public opinion in NATO member countries may not be as solid as we were once led to believe?
Well, let me just say that in a way the West brought it onto themselves because since last year we've heard that the West has long resisted many of the demands that the Ukrainian leaders have been issuing, and the more they publicly criticize the West, the more compliant the Western leaders would become. And we've seen again and again and again on a number of issues, specifically military supplies like tanks, air jets, long-range artillery. All of these demands were initially dismissed, but then accepted after Zelensky publicly called out all of the Western leaders. So in a way, I think Zelensky might have counted on that same tactic that worked for him before, and he believed that if he publicly would criticize these leaders, that at some point they will decide to do what he asked them to do. And this tactic is used by not just by him, but also by civic activists. So yes, this has been counterproductive in this particular case. And I think it has been increasingly clear that if this type of a tactic will continue, we are going to see some type of negative response from the Western leaders, where they would slow down the supplies of the military equipment or prevent the training from happening of the Ukrainian soldiers.
And very quickly, Sergiy, one other point. You know, NATO said that Ukraine would have to fulfill certain criteria. One of those criteria, of course, was that they would entertain membership of Ukraine in NATO when the conflict with Russia is over. But the other criteria that they're talking about, we heard the NATO Secretary General say the two-step process will become a one-step process. I mean, do we know what these criteria are specifically, and what stops any member nation from changing that criteria at some point in the future?
Well, several criteria are mentioned in the G7 joint declaration, which promises so-called security guarantees to Ukraine, although these are not guarantees, but the promises of further military assistance in return for Ukraine's progress on rule of law, democracy, anti-corruption, and economic reforms. So this is a standard package of political and economic reforms that NATO expects from future member countries. And President Biden emphasized that this is some of the issues, some of the questions that will be looked in the case of Ukraine.
Okay, Anton Fedyashin, of course, there were these tense moments at that summit, but there were also those, like President Biden, who struck a very optimistic note. Let's listen to some of what he had to say.
We will not waver. We will not waver. I mean that. Our commitment to Ukraine will not weaken. We will stand for liberty and freedom today, tomorrow, and for as long as it takes.
So, Anton, this, of course, is not new. Biden has said this before. But question is, when he says, as long as it takes, what is he talking about? What is as long as it takes?
Well, I don't think that President Biden really knows, actually. And his speech was the usual collection of one cliche after another, all mashed up together. It sounds like a campaign speech, which, of course, is what the United States is gearing up for. On the one hand, you have Joe Biden sounding the usual. On the other hand, some of the statements that Jake Sullivan has made within the past 48 hours about the importance of this conflict being over in the Russian media have been received as sort of subtle signals to Moscow that the West is actually getting ready for some kind of deal over Ukraine. The weapons are running out. Your opening report mentioned that Germany has committed 20,000 artillery shells. Let me put that into perspective. 20,000 artillery shells is roughly what Ukraine expends in 1 day of fighting. So the West is running out of weapons. There are major elections in Western countries coming up at the end of this year and even more importantly next year. And this war will have to be solved and put an end to. As long as it takes for Joe Biden is a question of November of 2024, because if by then the conflict in Ukraine is not settled in a way that all parties can claim some kind of victory in order not to lose face, he's going to be facing a very, very tough re-election bid, especially with the American economy facing a potential recession, and the situation is even worse in Europe. I think that partly explains why the Russians seem to be reasonably comfortable in simply maintaining the war of attrition that they've placed NATO in. And that so far, given their resources, they seem to be holding out fairly successfully.
Anthony Moretti, there are 11 NATO members that pledged at this summit to train Ukrainian pilots to fly United States F-16 planes. And the alliance also announced a program to modernize Ukraine's armed forces. Then, of course, there was that statement that Sergiy Kudelia talked about, which was from the G7, which seems to be now a subgroup of NATO, in which they gave certain long-term security guarantees to NATO, at least to Ukraine. So where do you see this going? Are we going to see an escalation in the conflict?
I agree with the idea that there's a timeline here that is not very necessarily favorable to the United States. If, for example, you look at the next 6 months or so and say, okay, the end of 2023, at some point, Joe Biden in 2024 is going to have to answer some pretty significant questions about what has the U.S. achieved with these billions upon billions upon billions of dollars in weapons that have been sent to Ukraine. On top of that, he's likely to face a Republican challenger who at best is going to be somewhat neutral in this conflict, despite what they might say, or if it's someone like a Donald Trump, is going to be openly pro-Russia in this situation. So, you know, I look at Biden and I think, okay, he's got about 6 months for all of this to wrap up, for this to come to an end, for there be some sort of agreement before there are questions raised in 2024 about whether he has mismanaged this conflict. Those are not going to go over well, especially, again, recognizing the domestic challenges he's going to face. It's not a good calendar for the West right now.
Andy Mock, at the start of this summit, the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, he gave the alliance's view on China. Let's listen to what he had to say.
China is not our adversary, and we should continue to engage. But Beijing's increasing assertiveness affects our security. China is increasingly challenging the rules-based international order, refusing to condemn Russia's war against Ukraine, threatening Taiwan, and carrying out substantial military buildup. China's nuclear modernization is unprecedented in speed and scale, and being carried out with no transparency. Allies agreed to continue working together to protect against China's coercive behavior.
So, there we heard it there, Andy. Jens Stoltenberg saying China is not an adversary, but then in the next sentence he says China is challenging the rules-based order. We've heard that before. It's threatening Taiwan, and the allies will work closely to protect against China's coercive behavior. Is that an open threat to China from NATO?
Well, it certainly sounds like it, Anton, but I think it's important to point out here, too, that with NATO, with the United States, that deeds, not words, is what matters. So I think whether it's Janet Yellen making conciliatory remarks or NATO, as we just heard, saying that China is not an adversary, we really have to look at what they're doing. And it reminds me of Ralph Waldo Emerson's comment that your actions speak so loud that I can't hear your words. And to go back briefly to Biden's comments, while spoken with great conviction, I think for even the most cursory observer, this comes across as delusional. And I think will also be a wake-up call to countries in Asia Pacific as well, that how much credibility, how much can they rely on American promises?
Sergiy Kudelia, NATO says Ukraine's membership will be considered when the conflict is over. And of course, inherent in that statement is a belief that Russia will agree to end this conflict without getting any kind of assurance on Ukrainian neutrality. I mean, do you envisage such a scenario?
Well, such a scenario is possible only if Russia is conclusively defeated on the battlefield and accepts that defeat because it is so weak as a result that it cannot restart the war and the conflict. That, I think, is the only condition under which that would be possible. But we also understand that...
But is that realistic? Do you see Russia being militarily defeated completely in this conflict?
Clearly, in the short term, it is impossible. And in the long term, we understand that the Russian military defeat is very unlikely, primarily because it always has another lever of escalation that it can use against Ukraine. And if it sees that it's actually losing that conflict, this war, it will use that lever to prevent the loss.
Anton Fedyashin, of course, China has concerns about NATO's push into the Asia-Pacific. Here's the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson, Wang Wenbin. Let's listen.
The long-term prosperity and stability of the Asia-Pacific region depends on the mutual respect, openness, mutually beneficial cooperation, and proper handling of differences among countries in the region. NATO's eastward expansion into the Asia-Pacific will only stir up regional tensions, trigger bloc confrontation, and even a new Cold War. Asia-Pacific countries do not welcome this. Many NATO countries do not approve of the NATOization of the Asia-Pacific, and neither does the region need an Asia-Pacific version of NATO.
So, Anton, here we have the Secretary General of NATO saying China is threatening its neighbors and bullying other countries. But if we look at what's happened just recently, the United States announced in March of 2021 that it will establish a network of precision strike missiles along the so-called First Island Chain. And that's only the first part of a $25 billion effort in the region. The United States already has bases in Japan, in South Korea. It just signed an agreement to sell nuclear-powered submarines to Australia. So where's the bullying coming from?
Anand, you know, I remember distinctly all of us being fairly surprised when Donald Trump, during his rambunctious presidency, seemed to be picking a fight with everyone at the table, the Canadians, the Mexicans, the NATO, the Europeans, the Chinese, and everyone else. And people being genuinely surprised at exactly what the strategy, the calculation was behind that. Well, how little has changed? Anyone who was surprised, like Jens Stoltenberg, for example, that the Chinese have not condemned the special military operation that the Russians have launched in Ukraine, need look no further than the list of facts that you just mentioned, and need look no further than NATO's website or Jens Stoltenberg's speech today. NATO seems to be bent on becoming an Indo-Pacific organization in order to contain China. And from the Chinese perspective, why would Beijing support the right of NATO to expand up to Russia's borders when NATO, the same organization, has already declared that it will basically be doing the same thing in the Pacific region? So this has to do with a complete lack of strategic vision and even empathy on the part of NATO, and it guarantees that Beijing and Moscow will continue to cooperate.
Okay, we have to go, Anton. We have run out of time, but thanks to you and thanks to the rest of our guests who appeared on the show. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.